I was hoping it was pretty obvious how to find my way back through there. I made it. All right. The gospel for today, the reading that we're going to use actually is from the Old Testament. It's from Joshua chapter 5, verses 9 through 12. The Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." And so that place is called Gilgal to this day. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept the Passover in the evening of the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan for the entire year. Promise spreads. I always get those packs of coupons in the mail, right? Everybody gets those. They usually go in their cycling. But I got coupons this week, and one of them was for these butter substitutes, like margarine, those kinds of things you see in the grocery store. These were butter substitutes made by Promise. Promise buttery spread, Promise light spread, Promise fat-free spread. Together they make up Promise spreads. I saw it when I was preparing for the sermon this week, and I thought, why, yes it does. Promise spreads. Countless generations ago, God promised to be God's people. God promised to be God to God's people. God brought them out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness, established a way of life for them, rained food down from the sky, and poured water out of rocks for them. God promised and God provided. Today we enter the story of God's people just after they have crossed over the Jordan River and entered into the promised land at last. By this point, a few more generations have passed. These Israelites are the descendants of those rescued from Egypt. Their whole lives, all they have known is nothing but wandering in the rocky deserts of the Near East. They have known nothing except following God in cloud and fire. They have known nothing but manna falling from the sky day after day. They have known nothing except for what God has provided for them directly. It must have been exciting to reach the promised land then, exciting and terrifying. All of a sudden they had crossed into a foreign land. They left the desert for the rich plains of Jericho. Imagine trading rocky, sandy soil for fields of juicy oranges and olives, nomadic tent life for the prospect of a settled community, the daily gift of manna for foreign crops, relative isolation for the lurking presence of foreign kings and peoples, the familiar fulfillment of promise for an uncertain future. Everything was in the process of changing. Would God still be God? Would they continue to be God's people in this new land? Would God still provide? It was a time of enormous transition, exciting but terrifying. I won't make you wait for the third page of the sermon. As it turns out, promise spreads. God does provide for the people. God uses traditional means like the rites of the Passover to provide, but there is something new, something foreign about it. For generations, God had provided manna to serve as the unleavened bread of the Passover. But the Israelites cross into the promised land, and suddenly the bread must be produced from crops of the land. It is at once both traditional and foreign, and yet God still provides. God's promise spreads to this new land. God's promise spreads over the Jordan and across the plains of Jericho. God's promise spreads beyond manna to the crops of this foreign land. God's promise is bigger than any place or nation or food or way of life. God's promise spreads. The Israelites are still God's people, and God continues to provide for them. That providing may be different. The manna has ceased. But God still provides for them in new, if foreign ways. God continues to be God. I rented a car in Syria one time. It was exciting but terrifying. I had left my year in Jerusalem and the plains of Jericho behind. I crossed the Jordan River in the opposite direction of the Israelites to meet a friend, Ellie, in Damascus. She was an intern from another site from Oslo. So we had both left our foreign lands for a foreign land. And for some reason, we decided that our promised land was the Syrian desert. It would be completely different, new and exciting, so we rented a car and we started off. We had a plan, of course, and the first day and a half was pretty relaxed. We enjoyed some of the sights and met a number of people along the way. But before long, things were starting to become very foreign. We didn't have a road map, and as it turns out, the maps in those guidebooks are loosely based on reality. Many of the roads were damaged or under construction, and so much of the trip was spent driving in the desert alongside next to the road, since it was in better condition. By the end of the second day, we were behind schedule, and darkness was beginning to spread over the horizon. We were far enough out that all of the signs were in Arabic only, and no one else was around, let alone anyone who spoke English. Pretty soon it was pitch black, and we were still out, alone, lost in the desert. We had come to a very foreign place. We weren't sure where we would stay. We weren't sure what we would eat or where we could get water. The only thing we knew for sure was that everything had changed. Would God still provide for us in traditional ways, in word and sacrament, in community, in relationships, in love, justice, peace, mercy, hospitality? In the dark, anxious night of a strange place, it was easy to wonder whether God's promise still spread before us in the deserts of Syria. But we prayed and we pressed on. We turned this way and that. We tried retracing our steps, and we simply drove around in search of someone, anyone. Eventually, we came across a small village and pulled up to a random house with a man on the front porch. He came down to greet us and gave us directions in Arabic to the archaeological site we had been looking for. He drew us a map and everything, but insisted that we come in for tea before we moved on. We agreed. The house had 2 rooms, both empty except for the elaborate oriental rugs and a ring of pillows lining the walls around the way. The entire family was inside, lounging on the carpets and watching TV. Yasser, the man we had met out front, was the patriarch of the household, since his father had died and his older brother was away. His mother, Mama, was the matriarch. She was inside with the younger siblings, sisters-in-law, nieces, nephews, and other relatives. Everything stopped the moment we walked through the door. 10 faces turned to us. A few words, and some of the women disappeared to make tea as we were invited to sit down and relax with Yasser and Mama. We engaged in whatever conversation was possible between Yasser's very limited English and my very limited Arabic. But we made things work until tea came, and then things just kind of continued. Yasser brought out his English book from school, and his 4-year-old niece Rafa inched ever closer to these strange people in her midst, introducing herself with an ornery little smile. Before we knew it, Ellie and I found a full dinner spread out in front of us, literally on a tablecloth on the floor. Pita with yogurt, several vegetable dishes, za'atar with olive oil, cubes of cheese, chilled clean water, fresh fruit for dessert. Yasser and Mama ate with us while little Rafa stole cubes of cheese at every opportunity, feigning an apology with her same little grin. We ate and talked and laughed, and when dinner was finished, we couldn't possibly refuse when they insisted that we spend the night. The rest of the evening was filled with a little bit of gymnastics, some arm wrestling, singing, dancing. Rafa stood tight and straight on Yasser's palm, and he lifted her up so that she could touch the ceiling fan. It was a free-for-all when Ellie's pack came in from the car with curious hands and eyes all over every little thing she had brought to Syria. They had never seen an iPod before, so we put the earphones on Rafa and watched her eyes light up with surprise as music filled her ears. But eventually it was getting late. The bedrolls were brought out, and the rest of the family in one room stayed with Ellie, and the two patriarchs, Yasser and I, went to the other room. It was only after we had retired in our room that Yasser and I talked about difficult questions: politics, religion, the death of his father at the hands of Bashar al-Assad, Israel, America, Iraq. It was a great sign of mutual respect. We could talk about such difficult topics, but were careful not to risk embarrassing one another in front of the family and friends. The next day, all of us shared breakfast and tea with goat's milk before Ellie and I were on our way. We left knowing that God's promise did spread. It spread to Syria, to the desert, to the dark of night, to Yasser, Mama, Rafa, to Ellie and I. Just as God provided for the Israelites in the Passover, so too did God provide for us in traditional ways: relationships, community, love, mercy, hospitality. But also, like the Israelites who received the crops of the land instead of manna, that which God provided was new and foreign. We could not have imagined that God would choose a Bedouin family to provide life-giving community, a 4-year-old child to speak holy words of hospitality, pita and tea to make God's presence known. Does exciting and terrifying sound familiar? We all have a promised land ahead of us, probably several throughout our lives. After all, life is filled with enormous transitions, and we're all searching constantly to where we are being called by God. Many things will change. Your world may be turned upside down, but remember one thing: promise spreads. In the story of God's people, God shows up. God provides in traditional ways, even when everything has the feel of being foreign. God provides and will continue to provide in word and sacrament, in community, in relationships, in love, justice, peace, mercy, and hospitality, because God's promise spreads. Whatever promised land lies ahead of you, no matter how foreign, know that God's promise precedes you. For your promised land is not a land that God has promised to you. It is far greater. It is a place somewhere ahead of you where God's promise waits for you, where you will continue to encounter the promise of God in new and unexpected ways, traditional and foreign ways, exciting and terrifying ways, because God's promise spreads. So venture forth, assured that you will find it, and rejoice when you do. After all, it is promise that made manna so delicious in the first place.